It's a joy to be here this morning. The passage that was so incredibly and beautifully and movingly read this morning is, I like to call it one of those 4 o'clock in the morning passages. What do I mean by that? You know, if you were to prod people, regardless as to whether or not you're a deep student of the Bible or had a passing, glancing knowledge of the Bible, you'd recognize the story of Jesus saying, don't keep the children from coming to me, let them come to me. In fact, you can go to a lot of churches. I'm looking around here, and maybe there might even be, look at that. There's a window right there with Jesus, kind of Eurocentric, but nevertheless, Jesus. Hey, what can we say? But the point I'm making is that this is a story that we know. We've heard it. And as we hear it, as we hear this, sometimes when you have a passage that's familiar, you ought to make sure that you don't just simply hear it in the familiar tone. Sometimes there are new nuances that need to be understood. And as you hear this passage, you hear the disciples' actions, first of all, in this. And first of all, it says that they speak sternly to those who brought them, the children, that is. In essence, shooing them away. You might say, well, why would they do that? Probably, possibly, most likely, because they presumed all of these children making their way to Jesus at this moment might have been a handful. That children in full childhood mode are full of exuberance and energy and life and joy, and sometimes that doesn't always fit neatly within the lines, praise God, thank you, Jesus, hallelujah. So Jesus, in the midst of this, because the disciples think that they're doing the right thing, they want to keep a measure of decorum, they want to have things move in a smooth and fluid way, but Jesus says, don't stop them from coming to me, which, let's face it, is what we would expect Jesus to say. But what he then says next is what should give us pause. What he then says next is what should weigh on our hearts, our minds, our consciences as we consider not only how to grapple with it, but how we should make it, in essence, come alive. For he says, don't stop them. Let them come to me, because heaven looks like them. Think about it for a second. Here the disciples are, and here's this gathering and all of the decorum that's attached to it, but here come these wonderful children, full of unpredictable exuberance, and Jesus says, this is what heaven looks like. So by Jesus' own definition, heaven may very well be a place of unrestrained joy. And if any fellow preachers are listening in, I was just sharing this a minute ago. If you're ever in a service and you hear a baby cry out, for the life of you, don't ever stop a baby crying, because a baby is the sound of life, fully formed and fashioned by a wonderful and loving God. And you better be glad that you're in a church where there are babies that cry. So by Jesus' own definition, heaven may very well be that place of unrestrained joy and the exuberant noise of life. Instead of stately, prim and proper decorum, maybe heaven. Have you ever been either on a New York City bus or subway around 3 o'clock on a school day? To say the very least, there's a level of energy that unfolds. In the mornings, it's a little different. Kids on their way to school are usually, like most of us, kind of drowsy and groggy, but in that afternoon measure, they come, and there's joy, there's life, there's noise. And some of us might want to at first say, these kids, they're so loud and unkempt in their manners, etc. But think about it for a moment. Shouldn't you be glad for that noise? Shouldn't you be glad for that exuberance? Shouldn't you be glad for that life lived outside of the margins, lived outside of the lines? And that's what Jesus is talking about when he says that heaven is like this. This should alone bring, I guess, some measure of relief to some of us if I'm going to spend any time trying to comprehend the incomprehensible concept of heaven, maybe Jesus' brief description here is more encouraging than a place of rigid imperial perfection that is the result of a judgmental God. Maybe this is the heaven that can really bring us joy and bring us hope. It might upset some of our apple carts. Now, I'm dating myself a little bit, but when I was a little kid, and usually on Sundays after church, invariably, my mom and dad would take us visiting other friends or family members, or I should say other families or other folk that we knew, members of our church or et cetera. And back in those days, you'd sit in the living room, and decorum for children being such as it was, we'd be quiet, but we'd sit on sofas that were covered in thick, stiff, and don't let there be a trace of humidity in there, sticky, heavy plastic covers. And the logic was that these horrendous looking plastic covers, and I hope nobody still has those on their furniture now. But the logic was that these covers were supposed to preserve the beauty and therefore the protection of the sofa or whatever. And I suppose it did, but at what cost? So I'm not so sure. Let me just step out on a theological limb right now. And maybe I'm saying this. Maybe I'm not looking for a heaven that resonates in the concept of perfection like I understand it. Maybe I'm looking for a heaven that is loud, that is exuberant, that is unpredictable, just like a whole mess of kids on the subway on an afternoon in the city of New York. So Jesus lets us know that children are a reflection of heaven. He even says it more powerfully, that these are to whom the kingdom, the realm of heaven belongs. So therefore, if Jesus is saying that in our hearing, as we hear it and read it now, doesn't it mean we need to think about how we treat and care for the children among us? And doesn't it mean that we should consider how we treat and care for the children among us as a sacred thing? Because after all, if they are the reflection of heaven, how we treat them and how we indeed envelop ourselves around them should be a sacred thing. There's so many ways to think about this, but for this morning, today, on this Children's Sabbath, I just want to leave you with these. First of all, if we say we love God, then we must love all our children. But here's the thing. Love embodied in justice allows us to love beyond our personal reach. What do I mean by that? I've been privileged and honored to serve as a pastor. And one of the most wonderful things about being a pastor is being able to be in the lives of the children of your congregation, to hold them up and dedicate them as infants and then to watch them grow and to send them off, be it to college or whatever it might be. And that's a blessing in so many ways. But human limitations being what they are, there are only so many families that I can connect with, so many children that I can indeed engage with in that kind of wonderful and nurturing and uplifting way. But if I'm committed to justice for all children, then beyond my own personal reach, hopefully and prayerfully, I'll be able to do and engage in some things that make a difference in their lives as well. So a love that is just goes beyond just the hair that I can caress, the shoulder that I can put my arm around, the baby that I can embrace. A love that is just means that I stand for what is right in the midst of unrighteousness. I speak out against what is wrong, even though the clamoring voices of those that are wrong seem to sometimes be louder. I keep walking, I keep marching, I keep working, because that's the way we do the sacred work of loving our children. So yes, we're commissioned and commended to love all our children, and we do that by the work of justice. We do that by speaking truth to power. We do that by engaging in the selfless acts of transformation of not only our own communities, but the broader societies in which we live. So yes, we're called to love beyond ourselves. But we're also called to protect, to give a measure of protection in the face of peril to the children, not only that we know, but the children even beyond, again, our reach. And if there was ever a time when you can say without hyperbole that children are in peril, it's now. While it's not a statistic for overt celebration, but at least it points to progress in that from 2010 to 2016, the number of children vulnerable because they did not have adequate medical care or coverage was reduced from around 7 million to about 5.5 million. Of course, as I said, that's still a shameful 5.5 million number that we've got to wrestle with. But the fact is that that number was reduced over these last numbers of years, indeed in large measure because of the Affordable Care Act. But where are we now? At a place where the potential for peril is very real, because there are those who would want to snatch away safety nets that are not earned, that are not rewarded, but should be an inherent part of what we are as a nation and as communities. So our children, indeed, find themselves in peril. We look around us and we see over and over again those things that wreak violence in every measure and in every form upon our children. And oftentimes the reverb from where I used to live and spend a whole lot of my time in Washington, D.C., is that, well, we'll enact sensible gun control laws. I'll never get elected to public office, not that I'm trying, because I'm one of those few people who kind of thinks maybe the Second Amendment was a little bit of a mistake and probably should be rescinded. But my point is this: we ought to find it a driving passion in us to make sure we do everything to protect children who are indeed in peril. But then also, with loving by way of justice, by protecting those who are in peril, we also are called to nurture and care. And to nurture our children, we have to hold up in front of them examples of truth and decency. And in this season, what a task that is, in that so much that is destructive and hurtful parades in front of us under the false guise of leadership on a daily basis. The prideful emptiness and hatefulness that we see unfold on a day-and-day basis. If you're like me, it wears you out. This past week, I'm sorry, and I'm a political creature. Jackie certainly knows this, but I was worn out. My heart was heavy. Not because of the vigor of debate back and forth, oh no, but because of the ugliness that passed itself off as leadership. And how tragic. I won't ever be counted in as one major fan of any component of what's in place now, but how sadly tragic that the one person, whether merited or not, that so many people were pinning their hopes on as the one last sort of standing adult in the room, decided to go off the diving board into the cesspool of personal and hateful attack. And fascinating that it just so happened to have been an African-American woman with measure of power and leadership that caused there to be such rancor on the part of those in power. I'll leave that where it is. But the point I'm making is, this wears us down. And here's what children give to us. Because we can get worn out if we remember that we do the right thing, we stand for the right thing, we fight for the right thing for our children. Somehow it gives us a measure of resolve that we might not otherwise have. You know, the word resistance has come about to be an important and appropriate rallying call, certainly since this past last November, but alongside resistance, I'm so glad for the word persistence, because I need to remember that I've got to stay the course. I've got to fight the right battles. And if I remember that I'm doing it not just simply for my own gain, but the wonderful thing, the wonderful gift that children give us is that they remind us that we're doing this not just for ourselves. We're doing this for time that endures beyond our time. And if we remember that, if we remember that we're fighting for what's right and doing what's right, not simply for ourselves, but for these children whom we love, who look like heaven, then maybe that will give us the measure of resolve that we need. If love and protection and nurture is sacred, not loving, not protecting, and not nurturing is by definition profane. So on this Children's Sabbath, we need to remember that we're called to be persistent in all that we're called to do to sustain and love our children. I guess the question is that when Jesus tells us this is what heaven looks like, you better be committed to it. And we ask the question, how will we commit and invest and persist for our children? We're called to do that not just when it's easy, but always, because it's always essential. Let me share a hopeful story. It's a fictional story by Elizabeth Ballard that I first heard shared by Marian Wright Edelman, leader of the Children's Defense Fund. It's about one school teacher, Gene Thompson, and one boy named Teddy Stollard. On the first day of school, Gene Thompson told her students, boys and girls, I love you all the same. But we know that teachers sometimes tell little white lies. Little Teddy Stollard was a boy Gene Thompson didn't like. He slouched in his chair and he didn't pay attention. He was often unkempt. He was a thoroughly unattractive, to Gene Thompson's estimations, unattractive boy, and she didn't like him. But teachers have records. And Gene Thompson had Teddy's records. In the first grade, they said, Teddy's a good boy, shows promise in his work and attitude, but has a poor home situation. Second grade records. Teddy's a good boy. He does what he's told, but he's too serious. His mother is terminally ill. Third grade. Teddy is falling behind in his work and needs significant help. His mother died this year, and his father shows no interest. Fourth grade. Teddy is in deep and troubled waters. He's totally withdrawn. Well, Christmas came, and the boys and girls all brought the teacher, Miss Thompson, a present. And they were all nicely wrapped, and they put them on Gene Thompson's desk. All except Teddy's, which was wrapped in brown paper and held together with Scotch tape. And on his present, he scribbled in crayon, for Miss Thompson, from Teddy. She tore open the brown paper bag and found a rhinestone bracelet with most of the stones missing and a mostly empty bottle of perfume. When the other boys and girls began to giggle, she had enough sense to put some of the perfume on her wrist and put on the bracelet, hold up her wrist to the other children and say, doesn't it smell lovely? Isn't the bracelet pretty? And taking their cue from the teacher, the children all agreed. At the end of the day, When all the children had left, Teddy lingered and came over to Jean Thompson and said, "Miss Thompson, all day long, you smelled just like my mother." And her bracelet, that's her bracelet, and it looks so pretty on you, too. I'm really glad you liked my presents. And when he left, Jean Thompson got down on her knees and buried her head in the chair and begged God to forgive her. The next day when the children came, she was a different teacher. She was a teacher with a heart. She cared for all the children, but especially those that needed help, and especially Teddy. She tutored him and put herself out for him, and by the end of the year, he had caught up with a lot of the kids and was even ahead of some of the others. Several years later, Jean Thompson got this note: "Dear Miss Thompson, I'm graduating from high school and wanted you to be the first to know. Love, Teddy." 4 years later, she got another note: "Dear Miss Thompson, I wanted you to know that college was not easy, but I've liked it. Love, Teddy Stollard." And 4 years later, there was still another note saying, "Dear Miss Thompson, as of today, I am Theodore J. Stollard, MD. How about that? I wanted you to be the first to know that I'm going to be married in July. And I wanted you to come and sit where my mother would have sat because you're the only family I have. Dad died last year. And she went and she sat where his mother would have sat because she deserved to be there. She had become a decent and loving human being. She had invested in the life of a child, even in the midst of that difficulty." So Jesus tells us, consider the children because heaven looks like them. Their faces look like heaven. And the faces we see in heaven, yes, oftentimes we love to think about the beautiful and cherubic faces that we consider as we think about the children that surround us. But also, you need to remember that heaven is made up of those faces that call us to the challenge of serving and loving selflessly. The name Alan Kurdi may not mean anything to you, but you know who he is because you saw his lifeless 3-year-old body washed up on the shore of a beach in Turkey as a Syrian refugee. And we're reminded that refugee and immigrant children, documented, undocumented, or otherwise, stand in peril. And it calls for our commitment to make certain that they have the safety and the embracing safety of our love and our commitment. Heaven may have beautiful faces, but it also has the faces of those children who are the victims of trafficking. And it's our responsibility to tear down the systems that have enslaved them, the evil systems that have made that possible. Heaven has the faces of those children who have been abused. And we're called upon to be the healing and hope for those children as well. Heaven has among itself the faces of the neglected. And we're called upon to embrace them and give them the surrounding of loving community. Oh yes, heaven has the faces of those who gathered around Jesus. Heaven has the faces of these wonderful children that we know and love and embrace here at Middle. But heaven also has the faces of a 15-year-old boy named Emmett Till. Heaven also has the faces of a 14-year-old boy named Tamir Rice. Heaven also has the faces of a Trayvon Martin. Heaven also has the faces of a 21-year-old child named Matthew Shepard. Heaven has faces of 20 children who went to school one morning in Newtown, Connecticut. So we're called upon to make sure that we see the faces of these children as sacred, and the work of loving them, the work of protecting them, and the work of nurturing them as sacred. Children in all their beauty, children in all their joy, children in all their frailty and vulnerability, children who deserve our love, our protection, and our nurture. So this is heaven.